Exercise 4, deploying a Windows 10 Azure VM. So in this section, we are going to be deploying an Azure Windows 10 VM using Bicep. We'll be deploying the Windows 10 VM so later we can install eFlow or Azure IoT Edge for Linux on Windows. After we have eFlow installed, we'll add an IoT Edge device, and then we'll retrieve the device credentials for the Edge device so we can configure our eFlow installation. At the beginning of each one of these sections, you also have some documentation links for further reference. So the first thing that we're going to do is deploy another Bicep template. So there are some recommendations here for VMs to be used for this section of the lab. There is a requirement that nested virtualization is supported. Information about which VM SKUs support nested virtualization can be found at the link provided here. Some of the suggested VM SKUs are listed here in the instructions as well. So let's move on to our first steps. So again, we need to make sure that we're in the hands-on lab files directory. So let's open the create VM Bicep file and just review the resources. So a couple of the resources that we have a storage account. We can see that we have a calculated storage name, and this is the ST eFlow boot diag. So this is boot diagnostic storage account for our VM. We have a public IP address. We have network security group to make sure that we have secure access to our VM. We have a virtual network. We have a network interface. We have our virtual machine. And then you can see an output is being used as part of this template as well. So now that we reviewed the template, let's take a look at the instructions again. So now we need to open the parameters file as we did before, so we can set the values. Ensure when you set the parameters on this next parameters file that you have the same favorite animal as the previous parameters file, and that your name matches as well. So I'm going to update my first name to Alan, my last name to Blythe, favorite animal to cat. Now we have the admin username and password. You can leave these as the defaults or customize the password to something if you like. I'm going to leave it the default for purposes of the demonstration. After I've made the values, I'm going to save my changes with Control S, but you can also use the file menu, file save. The last value that we need to get is the client IP address. So as we saw in month 1, we do need to make sure that we allow access for our IP address. So I'm going to switch back to Edge. I'm going to go to Bing and say, what is my IP? Bing's going to give me my address. I'm going to copy this to my clipboard, switch back to VS Code, and paste this, and then save the file once again. Now that we've updated all the values in the file as expected, now we're ready to create our deployment. I'm going to copy the command to my clipboard. This is one that can just be copied, pasted, and ran. Then I'll run my command. And as before, we'll see it say starting and then running. And then we'll switch back to the Azure portal to take a look at the progress. So we're already here at our resource group. If we go to deployments, we'll see a new deployment called Create VM. We can click that deployment and watch the progress here as well. Similar to the other deployment, we do have inputs as before. You'll notice all the inputs that we had provided. Without the VM admin password, this was marked as a secure parameter, so it's not able to be seen as part of the deployment here, though it was in fact used for the deployment. And here you can see some of the other parameters as well. No outputs, and then we can review the template. So we'll go back to overview and wait for our deployment to finish. We'll allow some time for the VM to finish creating. Okay, now that our deployment's complete, we can click Go to Resource Group, and now we'll see many more resources in our resource group. So we can see our virtual machine that's been created here, VM dash our student prefix dash eFlow. Let's head back to VS Code and take a look at the next step of our instructions. Now that it's completed, we can see here in our terminal that we do in fact see a succeeded message. And now we can move on to section 4.2. Section 4.2, create an Azure DPS enrollment. So an Azure IoT DPS enrollment, as we talked about in month 1, is best practice for provisioning your devices, along with a lot of great capability that it provides. So for our first step, we need to list our Azure IoT DPS resources. So we copy this command at our clipboard, paste it to our terminal and run. Here we see the name of the DPS here. So I'm going to left click twice, right click once. Since I'm using bash, copy that to my clipboard and then over to our notepad. And I'm going to paste this in my notepad. Next thing that I'm going to do is copy the following command to my clipboard, and we need to replace the DPS name. So I'll copy this command to my clipboard and then back to notepad. I'll paste it here. And get my DPS ID, replace the slug, copy the entire command back to my clipboard, back to VS Code, where I will execute our enrollment create command. So when that's done running, first we need to copy our primary key to our clipboard so we can save it in Notepad. We'll use this in a later step. So I'll copy this to my clipboard. We'll head back to Notepad. And I'll take note of my primary key here, paste it in. Then we'll go back to VS Code. And then we'll need to run the following command. So I'll copy the AZ IoT DPS show command to my clipboard. I'll head back to Notepad. I'll paste this command. Copy the name of my DPS. Place that, copy this command back to my clipboard. I'll head back to VS Code. And then I can run this command. After running this command, we're looking for the ID scope. So here in the instructions, find the ID scope. Note the value in your notepad, ID scope, such as this. So I'll find mine in my response here, and here it is, ID scope. I'll copy this whole thing to my clipboard. Then I'll head back over to Notepad. I'll take note of my ID scope. So I could just paste this whole thing here and just change the format a little bit. Now I have my ID scope recorded. Section 4.3, log into your Windows 10 VM. So to start off this section, we'll log in to the Azure portal. After we're here in the Azure portal, we'll find our resource group, RG IoT Academy. We'll go ahead and select that. We'll look through our list of resources and find our VM. You can see my unique student prefix and then eFlow, and the type will say virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and click my VM to open it. After we're on our VM, we can see various information about it, but let's go ahead and click connect and then RDP. Here it'll tell us the address, it'll tell us the RDP port, we'll leave the defaults, and we will click download RDP file. After we see that that's been downloaded, we can either open the file directly from the browser download, or we can go to Windows Explorer, find the download, and we can edit this RDP file. So I'm doing this to make sure that this is of good resolution for our lab material. So I'm going to set it to 1080p for myself, and then I'm going to click save to make sure that change saves for next time, and then click connect. It's going to ask me if I'd like to connect. I'm going to say don't ask me again. Go ahead and click connect. We know our username is IoT Academy. We know that our password is in the file that we looked at earlier, the parameters file. So let's go back to VS Code. So here in VS Code, we still have our parameters file. Here's the create VM params file. I'm going to copy this VM admin password to the clipboard. And then I'm going to go back to my RDP session, paste in my password. I'm going to select remember me, and then I'll click OK. It'll ask me if I'd like to connect. The certificate is not trusted. We're going to say don't ask me again, and yes, I'd like to connect. So now we're logging into the Azure portal, or into our VM rather, and we're going to see options for what information we'd like to send. I'm going to click accept and accept the defaults. We'll only be using this VM as part of our lab.